guest for this edition of the Debate Action Center, Sara Flounders, joins us from New York, and columnist at The Hill, Brent Budowsky, joins us from Washington. I'd like to welcome you both. Brent Budowsky, the ceasefire is only holding on paper. That's what it appears. It's evident from the latest shelling. 10 people have been killed, and didn't you ask, why is the truce that supposedly took effect on September 5th has been repeatedly violated?
Well, first of all, some of the truce is holding. Too much of the truce is being violated. Things are a little bit better after this temporary partial truce, but not good enough. I would argue that 90% of the fault for this lies with Russia and with the separatists, 10% with the Ukrainian government. That's my view about it. I think the most interesting thing that's happened in the last few days is Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia suggested it's time for yet another new reset of relations with the United States. If he is sincere about that, and I'm not saying he is or isn't, there might be the basis for the kind of agreement that should have happened a long time ago and should have happened really from the beginning. But I think the separatists still want out. The Russians are still backing them and giving them arms. They are encouraging the separatists to keep fighting, even though they say they're not. And it's going to keep getting worse until it gets better from where we are today. So I hope they can all step back and reach a political solution. I think the most important thing will be whether there's any chance at all of a reset of relations between Russia and the U.S., because if there is, things will get better. If there is not, things will get worse again.
I'm going to put that statement up for a challenge with you, Brent Budowsky, a little later. But Sara Flounders, our guest there, says that the separatists want out, but Russians want them to stay. Do you buy the scenario that Brent Budowsky is laying out there?
Well, I first want to challenge the very terminology which is used relentlessly in the media and used relentlessly by the U.S., saying again and again that these are separatists, that these are Russians, Russian forces, pro-Russian forces, pro-Moscow forces, that kind of terminology about people in the Ukraine. This is an internal resistance movement against a fascist coup that overthrew the elected government with U.S. funding. Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland bragged that the U.S. had invested more than $5 billion into making this transformation, into funding the social and political forces, into pulling NATO against the will of the majority of the people into NATO. This is really an effort of the U.S. to pull Ukraine apart and to pull it into NATO. And the forces in the east, in Donetsk and Lugansk, and in the other cities there, have resisted this fascist coup. They see themselves, and it's important in the media terminology, as anti-fascist forces, to terminate them again and again as Russian forces, which even President Obama did at the NATO meeting. He actually declared, and then NATO said, oh, we have satellite pictures. He declared that Russian troops and Russian tanks had invaded the Ukraine on the very day of the NATO meeting. And then the OSCE special monitors on the ground publicly contradicted NATO and President Obama and said absolutely no forces had crossed from Russia into the Ukraine. There were no tanks. And they actually called, this is a U.S. supported organization, but they really gave the lie to this and questioning used again and again that there's an invasion from Russia. Now, is there support in Russia for these Ukrainian resistance forces? Yes. Otherwise, they surely would have been crushed and totally destroyed by the U.S. funded and supported forces that have seized hold of Kiev. And that's a real issue here. It's will Ukraine be dragged into the NATO military alliance?
Very well.
Or
good
will
question
it be
there.
Allowed to
let's pose that to Brent
The forces
Budowsky.
in the East are calling for autonomy, and they're calling for a federation.
Great.
They are not Russian forces.
Brent Budowsky.
Yeah, first of all, this is a debate. I'm glad it is. I disagree with almost everything she said. Number one, the United States and Poroshenko do not want Ukraine torn apart. They want Ukraine brought back together where it belonged all along, number one. So she has that backwards. Number two, there is no dispute that Russian tanks were massed and troops in the number of 20 to 40,000 at different times were massed on the Russian border. on the Russian-Ukrainian border. There is no dispute that between 3,000 and 4,000 Russian forces have been in Ukraine for some time. There's no dispute that there is a direct cooperation, funding, financing, and arming of the internal forces in eastern Ukraine, the separatists. They want to be separate from Ukraine by the Russians. There's no factual dispute about any of those things. Now, one can throw around terms like fascist all you want. I stopped counting after the third or the fourth reference. That is irrelevant to what's actually happening. This is not a debate about rhetoric. This is a debate about whether Ukraine will remain Ukraine or whether Russia will be able to dominate at least half of Ukraine. The United States, the West, and with all due respect, the OECD want Ukraine to remain Ukraine. There is no attempt, no interest in Ukraine joining NATO. She's wrong about that. In terms of European trade, very possibly, the partial agreement is a step forward. But nobody is suggesting right now that Ukraine join Ukraine.
Great. I saw a reaction on Sara Flounders' face. I'm sorry, Brent Budowsky. Sara Flounders, I saw a reaction in your face. Go ahead.
Well, none of this is factually true and beyond dispute or any of those things as are being said. First of all, to call the forces in the East separatists, what they actually put on the vote, which overwhelmingly passed, was a right to a federation, the right to autonomy. That's not saying separation in any way whatsoever. And it was the U.S. that has tried to pull Ukraine apart and pull Ukraine into NATO. And the European agreement that Ukraine was to sign, which is what led to the coup, said that the military alliances that the EU was part of, Ukraine would become part of. Now that means joining NATO. There's no way to say that joining NATO is not on the agenda. That is what the agenda is all about. It is pulling Ukraine at no, I am certainly not. And now why was Ukraine even invited to the NATO meeting? That's not an, was Ukraine at the NATO meeting? Tell me, was Ukraine at the NATO meeting? It most certainly was. Was Poroshenko there? He most certainly was. So you want to deal in myth.
May I answer your question?
You want to deal in the myth that this is all about an independent Ukraine. You're just spreading total factual distortions.
Brent Budowsky, go ahead.
Now, there is nobody in the NATO alliance, not the U.S., not Europe, that is pushing for Ukraine to join NATO. They are not. It is not true. End of discussion. The issue with the Ukraine is whether there will be trade relations with the European community, the European Union, and that should happen to some degree. There may be interest in formally joining on the table right now. So it's just not true to talk about them joining NATO.
Excuse me, Professor, was Ukraine at the NATO meeting? Was Ukraine at the NATO meeting? Was Ukraine at the NATO meeting? Yes or no?
Yeah, they were discussing,
the only non-NATO member invited
military,
there? Yes?
May I answer your
case
okay,
closed.
if you ask a question, that's fine. Let me answer it.
Go ahead.
No, they were at the NATO meeting to discuss military aid from the NATO nations to Ukraine to defend against Russian subversion, Russian sabotage, Russian troops, Russian infiltration. That is why they were there. Not to join NATO, but to seek military aid from the United States and other NATO nations
Nuland's claiming
to protect
and bragging
themselves.
On tape.
Oh, stop with Victoria Nuland. Let me tell you a secret. Let me tell you a secret. I know. Let me just. Okay, you know, you can cry Victoria Nuland until the cows come home.
I'm just talking about facts.
I know some of the highest level. I'll give you some facts.
It's on tape.
I know very well and very closely. Please, may I finish answering your question, please? I know some of the highest level people in the American government. The policy is not being made by Victoria Nuland. It's being made well above her pay grade. You can throw that dog around all you want. It's false. She's not making the policy. And it is not the policy of the United States or NATO for Ukraine to join NATO. Now,
well, let me jump in here, Brent Budowsky. I apologize.
We can do that.
Brent Budowsky, I don't want to team up with Sara.
Sure. One
second. I'd like to, Sara Flounders, 1 second. Let me throw this at you, Brent Budowsky, not to team up with Sara Flounders against you. But this is what Obama has said. He has called on NATO to strengthen Ukraine's military. a move that some say is signaling a toughening of Washington's response to Russian aggression. Also, Obama said NATO should be open to accepting members in the region as part of a broader strategy to counter Russia. What does that show on the part of the U.S., Brent Budowsky?
Well, number one, the first two things you said are correct, that there is a discussion, as I said, of providing military aid from the United States and other NATO nations to the government in Kiev to defend themselves against Russian attacks, subversion, call it whatever you will. That is true. But in terms of NATO accepting or seeking membership by Ukraine, that is not the policy, the goal, the hope, or the intent of the United States or the NATO nations. Again, the point, to go back to what I was saying earlier,
what is a European agreement?
What needs to happen now
What's the
is
European agreement that Ukraine was being asked to sign?
Would you like to talk about let's talk about the European agreement in the Budapest Memorandum of the 1990s, when Russia agreed not to use military force or military threats against the sovereignty of Ukraine. No, you want to talk about agreements, we'll talk about the Budapest Agreement. If you don't know what it is, research it.
Well, let's talk about Secretary of State Baker saying NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east.
I'm not, Secretary of State Baker is no longer Secretary of State. It's Secretary of State Kerry. But
didn't he promise NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east? Did he not say that?
NATO is not expanding. What the Budapest Agreement memorandum stated.
NATO's not expanding. NATO has more than doubled in size.
May I finish?
NATO's not expanding. Are we on the same planet?
With all due respect, why don't I speak and then you speak and then I'll speak? Okay? If you want to cross-examine, we can play that game, but we're not in Moscow now playing by Putin's rules. Okay? That what the Budapest memorandum said, and Ukraine honored, is that Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in return for the protection of its sovereignty by the United States, Britain, and Russia. Russia has violated that. Russia has invaded the sovereignty of Ukraine after Ukraine honored its obligations under the Budapest Memorandum and gave up its nuclear weapons, which Ukraine probably has reason to regret that they did. What the United States and NATO want to do is to restore the status quo of what was agreed to by the Russians, by Ukraine, the Brits, and the United States in the Budapest Memorandum. That is the agreement. Trust me, nobody in the United States is pushing for Ukraine to go back into NATO. That is not true. They're not. That's a fact.
Sir,
what they do want is trade relations.
Sir Flounders, go ahead with response to Brent Budowsky.
All right. Okay, we could go all the way back, and it's important to Secretary of State Baker's commitment that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east if the Warsaw Pact a military agreement was dissolved. And that did happen. As a matter of fact, Russian troops were withdrawn from East Germany, from the GDR, and from East Europe. And right shortly after that, talking about 2003, 2004, the expansion of NATO happened. Now, we're talking about the Balkans, we're talking about Hungary, we're talking about Poland, the Czech Republic, and on and on. We're talking about Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. We're talking about right to the very borders of Russia. NATO has certainly expanded. And NATO has aggressively expanded with its troops, with its missile shields, with all of the forces involved. Now, the subversion of Ukraine to bring Ukraine and Georgia forcibly into NATO is part of the whole policy of the encirclement of Russia. It is aggressive military moves that have been moving forward very quickly. It's extremely dangerous. And yes, it's true that the U.S. wants Ukraine as a whole in NATO. And all of this was stopped by a genuine grassroots movement in East Ukraine that refused to go along with an imposed coup government, an overthrow of the elected government in Ukraine, an orchestration of completely set up elections, the use of fascist right-wing, right sector forces which use Nazi insignia in their flags, on their helmets, on their their very outfits.
Okay.
These forces, and it's not a laughing matter, the very terror that they have spread in Ukraine.
No, you
so
mentioned,
they want to bring
interject.
Ukraine as a whole into NATO, into the European Union. No, now I didn't interrupt you.
Let me ask you.
Their policy, and it's not a secret policy, is to bring Ukraine into the Western alliance and to bring it under the NATO umbrella. Now, that is why, and it was very publicly stated, Ukraine was at the NATO meeting, the only non-NATO member welcomed to the NATO meeting, and told that they would even have NATO protection. There's no way to get around Obama declaring publicly to the entire NATO meeting that there was a Russian invasion going on, and then the OSCE to say there's no Russian forces at all on the border. Now, does Russia have a right to have its tanks on its own side of the border, its troops on its own side of the border, when NATO is making aggressive moves like this and is right on the Russian border with tanks and troops? Of course. And they'd better have it, because given the NATO expansion to the very borders of Russia, this is risking world war. It's dangerous for all the people. And for again and again, during a ceasefire, for the forces in Kiev, these fascist forces, to be bombing civilian populations in Donetsk, in Lugansk, just consider what that means. There are ways of resolving this peacefully, but that is not what has been coming from Washington, and that is not what is being pushed by NATO. They're demanding the complete destruction of this resistance. It simply says, we want autonomy. We want a right to have a say in this. We want a right to be a federation.
Can I have a crack at that?
Ukraine's structure can't be decided from Kiev.
Can I have a crack at that?
Go ahead, Brent Budowsky.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Ernest Hemingway, and you write better fiction. Please let me finish. You write better fiction than he did. When was Secretary of State Baker last Secretary of State? Give me the date. You've quoted him, what, 6, 7 times? When did he leave as Secretary of State?
We're talking about, well,
your source?
Right.
When did he leave as Secretary of State?
Yes, exactly. This is the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we're talking about, this was in 1990, 1991.
You're quoting the Secretary of State.
Agreements. Yeah.
Right.
It's not a laugh.
Yeah. The best you can quote is a Secretary of State before President Obama.
That's when the Warsaw Pact.
No, okay, let me finish
yeah,
now.
but I also
let me reclaim
Obama
my time here
and Vice President Biden
I'd like equal
and Assistant
time.
Secretary of State Newland, who's
now,
just
interrupting
this year.
does not mean
interrupting
does not mean you're telling the truth.
Let Brent Budowsky talk here. Sir Flounders, Brent Budowsky needs some time. Let him get some time in here. Go ahead, Brent Budowsky.
You seem to have learned your attitudes of. Yeah, you seem to have learned your attitudes about democracy from Mr. Putin's Politburo over there, interrupting, berating, and making up fiction. Secretary of State Baker was Secretary of State before President Obama, before President Bush. Please let me finish. Before President Bush and before President Clinton. He was 4 presidents ago. You got to be joking quoting him. The Budapest Memorandum was being honored to the 1990s and the first decade of the 20th century, 21st century. It was being honored after Baker, after Clinton, after W. Bush. It was broken under Obama by Putin, and that's when the trouble started. So spare me your discussion of the Secretary of State from 20 plus years ago. That's not even close to relevant. Russia has the right to mass troops on the border, but not if it is threatening Ukraine in violation of the Budapest Memorandum. Russia does not have the right to infiltrate 3, 4, 5,000 of its special forces people in disguise wearing masks.
Squeeze in a question here to Sara Flounders. Sara Flounders, Sergei Lavrov coming up saying reset relations with the U.S., while the U.S. President of the UN saying that Russian aggression in Europe recalls the days when large nations trampled small ones, calling Russia's moves a threat to the world order.
Well, if we're going to talk about large nations trampling smaller countries, we really have to start with Washington, whether it's in Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya or throughout Eastern Europe, or whether we're talking about the bombing in the Balkans of Bosnia and Serbia. If we're going to talk about big nations trampling small countries, then the country that has more than 1,000 bases around the world is who we should be addressing. Now, if we're also going to talk about a consistent policy for 20-plus years, and that's why I quote Secretary of State Baker, but it's also why I also quote Victoria Nuland, Assistant Secretary of State now, or Vice President Biden, or President Obama, who are the present officials who are making absolutely outlandish claims about the Ukraine. And it is their aggressive policy for more than 20 years.
Okay, I got to unfortunately jump in here because we just don't have the time. We're fresh out of time. Thank you very much.
NATO
Sara
alliance.
Flounders from the International Action Center talking to us from New York. And thank you, Brent Budowsky. I'm sure we'll have you back, columnist at The Hill, who spoke to us from Washington. Thanks for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From me, in the